Fact number 4 takes us into something few dare consider: language and culture. Because even if we acknowledge that the Israelites may have looked more African than European, even if we admit that their ancestors walked through Cush and mingled with Egypt, the question remains: did they carry anything of that connection with them? The answer lies not just in bloodlines, but in rhythms of speech, of worship, of memory. And here's the shock. Hebrew itself, the sacred language of Scripture, is part of the Afro-Asiatic family of languages. Let that sink in. The very language in which God spoke to Moses from the burning bush, the language of David's Psalms and Isaiah's visions, shares its linguistic DNA with tongues that still echo across the African continent today. Afro-Asiatic is not a fringe category. It is a major linguistic family that spans North Africa and the Near East, including Cushitic, Berber, Chadic, and Semitic languages. Hebrew stands in the middle of that family like a bridge, connecting tongues of prophets to the dialects of desert traders, nomads, and priests from Ethiopia to Libya. Linguists like Christopher Ehret in Reconstructing Proto-Afro-Asiatic trace the family's origins to the Horn of Africa around 10,000 BCE, with branches spreading northward. Semitic languages, including Hebrew, Akkadian, and Arabic, evolved from this root, sharing grammatical structures like triconsonantal roots and vowel patterns. For example, the Hebrew word shalom, peace, finds echoes in Arabic salam and Amharic selam, all deriving from the same proto-root shilalem. But what does that mean in practice? It means we can find shared words, shared syntax, even shared religious vocabulary across ancient Hebrew and African languages. Consider the Hebrew word Adon, meaning Lord, a root echoed in various African tongues where authority is still invoked by a similar sound, in Hausa, Chadic, Adoni for judge, or in Somali, Cushitic, Adon for master. This is not coincidence. This is linguistic fingerprinting, and it gets deeper. In Nigeria, the Igbo people preserve customs that mirror those of ancient Israel. Circumcision on the 8th day, reverence for a single creator, dietary laws that echo Leviticus. The Igbo, numbering over 30 million today, have oral traditions claiming descent from Eri, a figure linked to Gad, son of Jacob. Anthropologist Thurston Shaw, excavating Igbo Ukwu in the 1950s, found bronze artifacts from the 9th century CE, showing ritual objects akin to biblical descriptions, like bells and staffs. The Yoruba, too, have traditions of Sabbath rest and priesthood rituals that align uncannily with the Torah. The Yoruba, from southwestern Nigeria, venerate Olodumare as the supreme creator, similar to Yahweh, and their Ifa divination system parallels prophetic oracles. Samuel Johnson, in his 1921 History of the Yorubas, notes legends of migration from the east, possibly the Nile Valley. Anthropologists have noted these parallels for decades. William Bascom, in The Yoruba of Southwestern Nigeria, 1969, highlights similarities in naming ceremonies and avoidance of pork, yet few theological institutions include them in their curricula. Why? Why do entire tribes across West Africa preserve ancient Hebrew customs, speak fragments of Hebrew phrases, and claim descent from Israel, yet remain dismissed as curiosities rather than clues? The Igbo oral tradition does not whisper this lineage. It declares it, "We are of Israel," not metaphorically, literally. And many of them still name their children in Hebrew, Chukwuemeka, God has done well, akin to biblical praise names. They keep feast days like the New Yam Festival, echoing Sukkot's harvest thanks, and preserve scrolls and prayer chants that bear the shape of Sinai. In the dry season, they sing psalms that have no known origin but carry unmistakable Hebraic cadences, with rhythms resembling the cantillation of Torah reading. Think about it. How does a tribe isolated by geography, war, and centuries of colonial erasure retain the practices of an ancient desert people unless they are the descendants of those people? And this is not isolated. The Lemba people of southern Africa have similar customs. So do the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, circumcision, kosher food laws, priestly classes, and sacred names that echo the Bible's oldest pages. The Beta Israel, also known as Falasha, maintained a pre-rabbinic form of Judaism, with Ge'ez scriptures and temple-like synagogues called masjid. Their history, documented in the 14th century Kebra Nagast, claims descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a union around 950 BCE that blended Israelite and Sabaean, South Arabian with African ties, lineages. But how did it all survive? The answer lies in memory, passed from mother to son, from elder to child, not through official record, but through lived tradition, through the hiding of scrolls, the chanting of old songs, the carrying of names. And that is why these traditions are not always exact replicas of rabbinic Judaism. They are older, wilder, rooted not in medieval European scholarship, but in oral memory of desert covenant. They are echoes of a pre-exile Israel, before the Babylonian captivity in 586 BCE standardized practices. And still, the academy resists. The seminaries dismiss. Linguists classify these overlaps as interesting, but stop short of asking the obvious question: what if this isn't resemblance? What if it's remembrance? What if we're not looking at mimicry, but survival? And here's where the conspiracy deepens, because colonial missionaries were well aware of these traditions. Letters from the 17th and 18th centuries record their shock at finding African tribes observing Passover, reciting Genesis stories, and invoking Yahweh. For instance, Olaudah Equiano mentioned Igbo circumcision in his narrative, comparing it to Jewish rites. But instead of celebrating the continuity of faith, they labeled it heresy. They called it pagan Judaism or primitive mimicry. And worse, they forcibly converted these tribes, banned their rituals, burned their texts, and replaced Hebrew names with European ones. The sounds of Sinai were silenced not by time, but by theology, rewritten, scrubbed, buried under centuries of empire. Missionaries like David Livingstone in the 19th century documented Lemba customs, but framed them as degraded Judaism, while Portuguese Jesuits in the 16th century destroyed Yoruba shrines to impose Catholicism. And yet they survived. You were never meant to hear this. You were taught that Africa was a mission field, not a homeland. That the languages of Israel flowed from Europe's academies, not Africa's oral memory. But now the songs rise again. Linguists have found Hebrew root structures embedded in Igbo syntax. For example, Igbo chi for God echoing Hebrew chai for life, or anu for me resembling ani. Geneticists have uncovered DNA markers in the Lemba that match the priestly lines of Israel. Scholars are beginning quietly, cautiously, to admit what the people themselves have always known. Could it be that Israel did not forget Africa, but that Africa remembered Israel? And if the rituals align, if the words echo, if the names survive, then what does that say about who the Israelites really were? Could the very tribes taken into slavery have been those who still bore the name of Jacob on their lips? Could the cries of their songs have once risen from tabernacles under the African sky? Ask yourself this. Why do the very people who preserved these customs across centuries of exile and violence now find their claims ignored, their voices dismissed? Is it because they are wrong, or because the truth is too dangerous to acknowledge? We must go further. Because if the languages and rites were preserved in Africa, then those who erased them knew what they were silencing. And that silence, that deliberate suppression, begins to make sense when we look at who stood to gain when we follow the hands that redrew Christ in pale oils and tore maps from their atlases. Because the erasure was not random. It was political, strategic, and its epicenter was not in Africa, but in Europe. That is where we turn next, into the Renaissance halls and colonial pulpits where a new image of Israel was crafted and the old one burned. Let's move now to fact number 5. And this is where the story turns from forgotten memory to something more disturbing. If the Israelites were black, and if their ancient language and customs endured across African tribes, then why has the world come to imagine them so differently? Why is the Bible filled with images of pale-skinned prophets, soft-haired messiahs, and golden-haired disciples walking under Middle Eastern suns? This is not a question of artistic preference. It is the result of something deliberate. Fact number 5 is this. The image of biblical Israel was whitewashed by empire, not by accident, by design. The transformation began in the shadows of cathedrals and the courts of kings. For centuries, the earliest depictions of Christ and the prophets found in the Roman catacombs showed them with dark skin and coarse features. These images weren't symbolic. They were drawn by people who lived in the Mediterranean world, who knew what Semitic and African faces looked like. The catacomb of Hyksos from the 3rd century CE features Good Shepherd figures with short, curly hair and tanned skin, reflecting the ethnic diversity of early Christians, including converts from Egypt and Syria. But by the 1400s, a new vision of Scripture was rising, one crafted not by prophets, but by painters under papal patronage. Think of Michelangelo, whose Sistine Chapel, painted between 1508 and 1512, defined the image of Adam as a pale European. Commissioned by Pope Julius II, the ceiling's creation of Adam shows God and Adam with muscular, fair bodies inspired by Hellenistic sculptures like the Laocoon, unearthed in 1506, or Leonardo's Last Supper, where every apostle could pass for a Florentine nobleman. This shift wasn't innocent. During the European Renaissance, a period from the 14th to 17th centuries, fueled by rediscovery of classical texts and patronage from wealthy families like the Medici, art became theology, images became dogma. Humanists like Marsilio Ficino translated Plato, blending philosophy with Christianity, but visual arts prioritized European ideals. And as European empires stretched their influence into Africa and the Americas, they carried not only Bibles, but paintings. The Age of Exploration, beginning with Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage to India and Columbus's 1492 landing in the Americas, opened new frontiers for colonization. Missionaries arrived in ships holding portraits of a white Jesus in one hand and Bibles in the other. In Mexico, Hernán Cortés in 1519 brought Franciscan friars who used European-style icons to convert Aztecs, while in Africa, Portuguese missionaries in the Kingdom of Congo by 1491 introduced pale Madonnas, leading King Afonso I to adopt Christianity but adapt it with local elements. And slowly, generation by generation, the people who had once remembered Israel's face forgot. But why? Why would those who claim to serve the truth distort the image of the truth himself? The answer lies in power. During the colonial era, theologians crafted doctrines not only to convert but to control. One of the most damning examples is the so-called Curse of Ham, a twisted interpretation of Genesis 9 used to claim that black people were destined for servitude. This idea never existed in ancient Jewish understanding. It was born in the minds of colonial clergy who needed theological justification for slavery. Rabbi David Kimhi in the 12th century saw it as geopolitical, not racial, but by the 15th century, Portuguese chronicler Gomes Ernest de Zurara, in Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, 1453, invoked it to rationalize African enslavement. In missionary schools, Children were taught that their ancestors had no place in biblical history. Churches replaced Hebrew songs with European hymns. Names like Yehuda and Miriam became James and Mary. In some places, the very idea that Jews could be dark-skinned was declared heresy. Scrolls were confiscated, traditions erased, rituals banned. The old names were cut from the record, inked over in Latin, then buried in the archives of European universities where African scholars were forbidden to study. The University of Salamanca in Spain, key in training missionaries for the New World, emphasized Thomistic theology that implicitly supported hierarchy. A child in West Africa or the Caribbean might grow up seeing white saints on every stained glass window, hearing that salvation looked nothing like them. But the record tells another story. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea convened under Constantine, the Roman emperor who sought to unify his empire under one faith. Though that council standardized key doctrines like the Nicene Creed affirming Christ's divinity, it also marked the beginning of Europe's theological control over Scripture. Later councils, like Chalcedon in 451 CE, would determine which texts were canonical and which were apocryphal. And in that process, many writings that emphasized African roots or included darker-skinned prophets vanished from the list. The Book of Enoch, cited in Jude, describes visions with Ethiopian influences, but was excluded from the Western canon, preserved only in Ge'ez by the Ethiopian Church. Fast forward to the 1400s through the 1800s. This was the age of colonization when European powers carved up Africa and justified their rule through religion. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 formalized the scramble for Africa, with missionaries like those from the London Missionary Society paving the way. Missionaries weren't just teaching the gospel, they were replacing one history with another. African depictions of Christ and the apostles were confiscated and destroyed. Oral traditions were mocked. Scholars who questioned the dominant narrative were excommunicated, silenced, or dismissed as fringe. And the whitewashed image became law. Ask yourself, why would the Sistine Chapel become the defining visual theology of the Western Church? Why would Renaissance artists paint prophets who lived under desert suns with ivory skin and flowing golden hair? The answer is unsettling. A God who looks like the colonizer becomes easier to obey. A Bible filled with white prophets legitimizes white supremacy, and so the erasure wasn't passive. It was strategic. Entire cultures were recast. The real question is, how did they pull it off without opposition? The answer lies in the control of access. By the 17th century, only approved church scholars could read Hebrew or Greek. The common believer relied on Latin translations like the Vulgate, and the original names, skin tones, and cultural contexts were washed away like ink under rain. Art became the catechism. White marble statues stood in church halls where no brown image of Moses or David remained. Bernini's 17th century sculptures in St. Peter's Basilica continued this tradition. But while Europe forgot, Africa remembered. Songs of Exodus echoed in the slave plantations of the Caribbean. Psalms were sung in Yoruba dialects, and the old names survived, whispered in family lines and hidden prayers. The image may have been altered, but the truth refused to die. And here's where we confront the chilling part. If Christ's face was changed, what else was changed with it? If the prophets were rewritten, what happened to the words they spoke? If the Israelites were recast to fit an empire's image, how much of their history was erased in the process? You were raised on white icons. But what if those were only replacements for something much older? Something that looks more like you than you were ever allowed to believe. We were never meant to see this, but the veil is lifting, and the record still breathes beneath the suppression, in maps, in songs, in forgotten kingdoms. The true Israel still echoes, And that's where we turn next. Because while Europe painted over the past, Africa kept records the world refused to acknowledge. Some were written by Arab geographers, others by shocked Portuguese explorers, who found Hebrew prayers in the mouths of West African kings. The evidence was hiding in plain sight, and it's time we open those scrolls. Fact number 6 is this: the Israelites never vanished from the African continent. They were mapped, recorded, witnessed, and yet the world was told they disappeared. But history never fully forgets, not when the truth is etched in the journals of explorers, the scrolls of geographers, the oral traditions of kings, and the faded ink of forgotten maps. While Europe repainted the faces of prophets, Africa remembered their names, and the evidence still speaks. In the 10th century, Arab geographers like Al-Yaqubi and Ibn Hawqal described thriving Jewish communities scattered across the Saharan trade routes. These weren't whispered legends or vague guesses, they were direct reports, first-hand observations of Hebrew-speaking tribes keeping ancient customs. Al-Yaqubi, in his Kitab al-Buldan, Book of Countries, around 891 CE, noted Jewish settlements in the Fezzan region of Libya, trading in gold and slaves, maintaining synagogues amid Muslim neighbors. In Timbuktu, the famed city of learning founded around the 5th century but flourishing under the Mali Empire in the 14th century, records suggest Jewish scribes once transcribed scriptures by lantern light in hidden alcoves, their presence woven quietly into the rhythm of desert life. Leo Africanus, a 16th century traveller born Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan, described Timbuktu's scholarly community in Description of Africa, mentioning many Jews involved in commerce and learning, though by his time persecution had driven many underground. Al-Idrisi, the 12th century cartographer whose maps shaped Islamic and European geography, marked the existence of Jewish enclaves in places where most would never expect, along the Niger River, near present-day Mali, and in the highlands of Ethiopia. Al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana, commissioned by King Roger II of Sicily in 1154, depicts Africa with remarkable accuracy for the time, labeling regions like Bilad al-Yahud, land of the Jews, in West Africa. These were not marginal people. They traded, built, prayed, they remembered. Then came the Portuguese. In the 1400s, as European ships hugged the African coastline, explorers documented Jewish villages with rituals strikingly familiar to the Hebrew Bible. Some marveled, others recoiled, but the records exist. Portuguese accounts describe the Jewish presence in the Loango coast and the Kingdom of Congo. Hebrew inscriptions were found etched into walls and objects. Even local rulers were reported to trace their lineage to Solomon or David, claiming a covenant memory long rejected by the West. Diogo de Azambuja, in 1482, establishing Elmina Castle in Ghana, noted local tribes with Jewish customs, as recorded in Rui de Pina's chronicles. Consider the Ethiopian Beta Israel, a community whose roots trace back thousands of years, who preserved Hebrew customs without contact with Rabbinic Judaism or modern Israel until the 20th century. Their Torah was written in Ge'ez, their temple sacrifices remembered, their Sabbath kept. European theologians scoffed at them, questioning their legitimacy because their skin was dark, their language unfamiliar. But the Ethiopian church never forgot them, and neither did prophecy. Psalm 68:31 says, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." For centuries, that verse was seen as poetic. But what if it was literal? What if Ethiopia preserved not just belief, but bloodline? The Beta Israel community wasn't discovered by scholars looking for lost tribes. They were already living as one. James Bruce, a Scottish explorer in the 1770s, documented their practices in Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, describing their isolation and fidelity to Mosaic law. Some rabbis embraced them, others hesitated. But in 1975, the Israeli government recognized them as legitimate descendants of ancient Israel under the law of return. That recognition wasn't based on genetics alone. It was based on memory, on preservation, on proof no longer easy to ignore. And what about the Lemba of southern Africa? Known for their dietary laws, circumcision on the 8th day, and oral traditions of having descended from the men who came from Judea. Their story defies every colonial stereotype. Oral histories speak of migrating from Sena, possibly Yemen or Zimbabwe's Great Zimbabwe, after the temple's destruction, carrying the Ngoma Lungundu, a drum-like ark, and what happened when scientists finally tested their DNA. They found the priestly marker of the Cohen lineage in the Lemba's male population. We'll get to that later, but for now we must ask, why were these communities documented in maps, witnessed by travelers, known by neighbors, treated as invisible? Why are schoolchildren taught of Timbuktu's manuscripts, but never told that some of them held Hebrew prayers? The Sankore Mosque's library contains over 700,000 manuscripts, including Judaic texts. Why do universities keep Al-Idrisi's maps under glass, but not teach what those maps truly say? You were never supposed to find this trail. The names were distorted, the tribes renamed, the scrolls kept behind locked vaults or mislabeled as folklore. But the truth has hands and memory, and the maps were never silent. We were told that Jewish presence in Africa was an anomaly. But what if the anomaly is the silence that followed? What if the greater sin was not ignorance, but suppression? The old names, Judah, Levi, Benjamin, survived not in European seminaries, but in West African dialects, in the lips of elders who never stopped telling the story of a journey from the east, across the desert, into the forests of Nigeria and Ghana. The Igbo people in particular maintain oral traditions that trace their ancestry back to Jacob. Their customs echo the Torah. Their stories speak of lost altars, ancient exile, and a covenant unbroken. Were all these communities mistaken? Or did they remember something the rest of the world chose to forget? Ask yourself, if Jewish identity survived in the highlands of Ethiopia, the sands of Mali, and the forests of West Africa, what else survived with it? Could it be that the remnant of Israel was never fully lost, just overlooked, hidden not by time, but by choice? The accounts exist. The maps were drawn, the names were preserved, the scrolls were written. And this is the part they never wanted us to see. Because if Israel never left Africa, then history must be rewritten, and prophecy must be reread. But the evidence does not lie, and the further we follow it, the more it begins to sing. Because archaeology and genetics do not silence this truth, they begin to amplify it, and in the next chapter we will see that even the bones remember. Fact number 7 leads us deeper still into the dust of forgotten ruins and the code hidden in blood. This is where science, prophecy, and silence collide, because if the Israelites never vanished from Africa, then archaeology should speak. If the priesthood endured, then DNA should whisper it. And if truth was buried, then bones and stones would cry out, and they have. But for decades, those cries were dismissed, mislabeled, or simply filed away in archives never meant for public eyes. Let us begin in southern Africa among the Lemba people. For generations, they preserved practices that made anthropologists curious but uneasy. They claimed descent from ancient Judeans, upheld kosher-like dietary laws, practiced circumcision on the 8th day, revered the Ark of the Covenant, and even observed a modified Sabbath. Elders told stories of ancestors who came by sea from a land of stone houses and scrolls, bringing with them sacred knowledge. The world called these tales legend until the science arrived. In a groundbreaking study from the late 1990s, Researchers like Tudor Parfit and Karl Skorecki discovered that a significant percentage of Lemba men carried the Cohen modal haplotype, a Y chromosome genetic marker associated specifically with the ancient Israelite priestly line, the descendants of Aaron. Let that settle for a moment. The priestly bloodline, once thought confined to the pages of scripture and the halls of European yeshivas, echoed in the veins of black African men in Zimbabwe and South Africa. The CMH, identified in 1997 studies published in Nature, appears in about 50% of self-identified Kohanim, Jewish priests, worldwide, with mutations dating back over 3,000 years. Among the Lemba, it's found in 53% of their Buba clan, their priestly group. How did the world respond? With silence. Scientific journals reported the findings briefly. Parfit's book, Journey to the Vanished City, 1992, detailed the quest. But theological institutions remained mute. Schools did not update textbooks. Seminaries did not revise lineages. The discovery was not debated. It was buried. Think about that. If the Lemba had been blonde-haired and blue-eyed, would the announcement have shaken the theological world? Would it have been welcomed as a miracle? Instead, it was treated as a curiosity, a footnote, a story too disruptive to be fully embraced. But the Lemba are not alone. Turn now to Ethiopia. The Beta Israel, already recognized by the State of Israel as legitimate descendants of the tribes, carry DNA that reflects a Middle Eastern and African blend. Studies by the Hebrew University in 2012 found Levantine genetic components supporting what their traditions have always claimed, that they are the remnant of a covenant kept in the highlands. These findings align with the records of early church fathers, like Origen in the 3rd century, who mentioned Jewish communities in Africa, and Islamic geographers like Al-Mas'udi in the 10th century, describing Israelites beyond the Nile. Even the apocryphal Book of Jubilees, preserved in the Ethiopian canon and dating to the 2nd century BCE, places some tribes of Israel in territories beyond the Nile, retelling Genesis with added details on migrations. Though speculative, these echoes now resonate with the witness of science. Consider also the archaeological sites along the Nile and into Elephantine, where Hebrew inscriptions have been found carved into stone walls and temple remnants. These writings, some dating back to the 5th century BCE, confirm that Jewish communities once flourished in Egypt, maintaining synagogues, laws, and sacrificial practices. The Elephantine Papyri, discovered in 1893 by Charles Edwin Wilbur, include over 170 documents from a Jewish military colony under Persian rule, 525–332 BCE, detailing marriages, property disputes, and appeals to Jerusalem for temple rebuilding after destruction in 410 BCE. One particular papyrus, the Passover letter from 419 BCE, instructs on festival observance, mirroring Exodus 12. These were not marginal outposts. They were organized, literate, covenant-keeping identities under foreign rule. The standard narrative told us Israel disappeared after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE and Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. But archaeology says they adapted. Scripture told us they would be scattered, Isaiah 11:12. But prophecy also said they would remember, Jeremiah 31:10. The evidence is not theoretical, it is tactile, it is bones and ink, it is chromosomes and ancient prayer scrolls discovered in desert caves, like the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, 1947, which include Ethiopian-influenced texts. So why does the silence remain? Why are these findings still absent from Sunday sermons, from academic theological syllabi, from Christian media? Could it be that the truth is simply too disruptive, that a black Israelite identity, verified by both scripture and science, threatens the neatness of a Western theological narrative constructed in ivory towers and colonial pulpits. You were never meant to read these genetic studies, but they exist, published in journals like American Journal of Human Genetics. You were never meant to know that sacred names once carved in Hebrew rest beneath African soil, but they do. And even now, teams of archaeologists work in relative quiet, brushing sand from stones that challenge the official line, like the Aksum excavations in Ethiopia, revealing obelisks with Sabaean inscriptions linking to Solomon's era. The question is not whether the evidence exists. It is whether we are willing to see it, because the silence has never been about absence. It has always been about power, about who gets to tell the story. But the story is changing. And if the blood of Aaron can still be traced in the highlands of Zimbabwe, then the covenant endures. And if the bones of worshippers still lie buried in Egyptian temples with Hebrew etched into the walls above them, then the exile was never a forgetting. It was a remembering in waiting. The deeper we go, the more the lines converge. Oral traditions, cartographic records, liturgical customs, genetic data, archaeological findings, all pointing to a truth once feared too dangerous to say aloud. But here we are, and here is the question. If Scripture foresaw scattering, and the bones confirm survival, and the blood remembers lineage, what does that say about where we are in the timeline of prophecy? Because there is one more layer still, one that begins not in the past but in the present, a regathering, an awakening, a prophecy that was never symbolic but literal. Fact number 8 may be the most haunting of all, because it forces us to ask not only what was hidden about the Israelites, but who was deliberately erased from the center of their story. And here the mystery deepens, because this is not just about lineage, not just about tribes scattered across the earth or forgotten bloodlines resurfacing. This time we are forced to look at the image of Christ himself and ask, what did he really look like? And more importantly, why was his image changed? Revelation 1:14-15 describes the risen Christ this way. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. This isn't poetry alone. It's physical, unmistakably so. Hair like wool, skin like burnished bronze, glowing as if forged in fire. But instead of embracing this as part of the mystery of the incarnate Son, European translators softened it. Painters ignored it and theologians excused it. Over centuries, this description was reshaped until we were left with an image of Christ that bore the features of European royalty rather than an exiled Galilean craftsman walking under the sun of Judea. How did it happen? And who made that decision? The clues are not subtle. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bishops gathered to establish canon and unify Christian doctrine across the Roman Empire. Convened by Constantine after his victory at Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, where he claimed a vision of the cross, the council debated Arianism, affirming Christ's co-eternity with the Father. But the political atmosphere was thick with imperial pressure. Constantine needed a God that could unite Rome, not divide it. And so the process began, not just of affirming doctrine, but of silencing contradiction. Early texts that circulated among Eastern and African churches, including the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, were excluded from the Western canon. These texts, many preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible to this day, include descriptions and genealogies that tie the Messiah to broader Semitic and African lineages. The Book of Enoch, quoted in Jude 1:14, describes angelic visions with Ethiopian settings, but was deemed too apocalyptic. Were they discarded because of theology or because of geography? And what geography implied about skin? By the time European missionaries crossed into Africa centuries later, the process was complete. Christ was blonde, Mary was pale. The apostles glowed with pink cheeks and painted halos. In Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, God reaches out to Adam with a face not drawn from Middle Eastern ancestry, but modeled after a European noble. In churches across the world, stained glass repeated the image until it no longer needed explanation. White became holy by default, and slowly the darker truths were buried. But the old books remained, in dusty Ethiopian monasteries, in translated fragments smuggled across centuries, in oral traditions too stubborn to die. In the Ethiopian canon, which includes 81 books compared to the Protestant 66, Christ's heritage is described with a clarity the West avoided. The word wool is not metaphorical. It's literal, used to describe his hair. The phrase burnished brass is not poetic suggestion. It was used in reference to metallurgy, to something visibly dark, deep and glowing, as in Ezekiel 1:7, describing angelic beings. And yet, these terms were quietly sanded down in modern translations. The King James Version of 1611 retains wool and brass, but later revisions like the NIV 1978 say white like wool for hair and like bronze glowing in a furnace for feet, shifting focus. This wasn't translation. This was redesign. Why? Who benefits from a Christ stripped of his cultural and ethnic markers? The answer lies in the history of conquest. When empires spread, they rewrite the gods in their own image. It's always been this way, from Babylon adopting Marduk to Rome syncretizing with Sol Invictus. And so the Christ who overturned temple tables, who walked with the poor and warned of judgment, was reshaped into a softer figure, lighter, quieter, closer to the kings and popes who ruled in his name. But the silence is louder than it seems, because even now those who depict Christ as anything other than white are called heretical, divisive, or dangerous. Even now, to imagine the Messiah as a dark-skinned man with woolly hair feels controversial, not reverent. Think about that. Why is the truest description in the Bible the one least repeated? Why is the image Revelation gives us treated like metaphor, while Renaissance paintings are accepted without question? You were raised on a Christ painted by Da Vinci, but Revelation offered you something else. And buried beneath centuries of soft-lit portraits and cathedral murals is a truth too bold for empire. That the Son of God stood in human history as a man of color, walking dusty roads under imperial occupation, offering salvation that crossed tribal and ethnic lines, and then was whitened to make him easier to control. This isn't a debate about race. It's a confrontation with suppression. Because if they changed the appearance of the Messiah, what else did they alter? What else was softened or erased or reinterpreted? The early church in Africa thrived long before European missionaries arrived. The Ethiopian eunuch was baptized before Paul's letters were even finished, Acts 8:26-40. The Coptic Church, founded by Mark the Evangelist in 42 CE, preserved apostolic traditions while Europe descended into war. So why was this legacy ignored? Why were these people called pagans until they converted, when they had been following Christ longer than the churches that labeled them? Athanasius of Alexandria, a 4th century bishop key to Nicaea, was Egyptian. Likely dark-skinned, yet icons depict him pale. What you are seeing is not a simple oversight, it is a pattern, and patterns have architects. When the image of Christ changes, so does the identity of his people, and when his people forget who they are, the covenant breaks in the heart, not just on paper. The Hebrew Israelites were not just stripped of land or language, they were stripped of memory, and the most effective way to sever memory is to replace the face of your Redeemer. You think that's the end. That's only what the Western canon allowed, because beyond the painted icons and redacted scriptures lies something even more urgent, a prophecy, a promise that the forgotten will remember and the scattered will be called home. And as we turn to the final fact, we will see that the awakening has already begun. The question is, are we ready to see what happens when a people regains its name? Fact number 9 is not just a revelation from the past. It is a prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Because if the Israelites were dark-skinned, if they were scattered by slavery and colonization, if their image and lineage were erased from memory, then we must now ask the question that every prophet saw coming. What happens when they awaken? What happens when the forgotten remember? Isaiah 11:11 speaks of a moment few were taught to expect. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again, the second time, to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left, from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush. Cush, Ethiopia. A name tied to the oldest African dynasties, to the descendants of Ham, to lands where Israelite customs were preserved in secret. This is not vague symbolism, it is geography. Jeremiah 23 declares the same promise. I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries whither I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds. For centuries, it seemed like poetry. But then, in 1984, something happened. Operation Moses, a covert airlift carried over 8,000 Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, from famine and civil war into the modern state of Israel. Organized by the Mossad and the CIA amid Sudan's instability, planes flew secretly at night, rescuing people who had walked hundreds of miles to refugee camps. Their arrival stunned the world. Many had never seen Jews who looked like them. And yet, the Beta Israel traced their heritage back not through Europe, but through oral tradition, priestly lineage, and ancient Hebrew customs preserved in the highlands. They had kept the Sabbath. They had honored dietary laws. They had circumcised their sons on the 8th day. And they had waited, not for the invention of an identity, but for the fulfillment of a promise. You were never meant to see that airlift as prophecy. It was reported as humanitarian aid, not a divine signal. But when we read the scriptures with clear eyes, we begin to see it for what it was, a whisper that the regathering had already begun. Operation Solomon in 1991 followed, airlifting 14,000 more in 36 hours during Mengistu's regime collapse. And this was not an isolated miracle. From the 20th century onward, a movement began to stir across the African diaspora. In Jamaica, in Harlem, in Chicago, in Nigeria, in South Africa, men and women began to question the version of history they had been taught. They opened Bibles. They saw the descriptions. They read the curses. And they asked the forbidden question, what if we are the ones? What if the story of Israel is not a foreign tale, but a stolen inheritance? The Hebrew Israelite movement, emerging in the late 19th century with figures like William Saunders Crowdy founding the Church of God and Saints of Christ in 1896, claimed African Americans as descendants of the tribes. In Jamaica, Rastafarianism, influenced by Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the 1920s, saw Haile Selassie as a messianic figure tied to Solomon's line. And slowly, steadily, communities began reclaiming names once buried: Yehuda, Israel, Levi, Ephraim. Some formed congregations like the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, who migrated to Israel in the 1960s under Ben Ami Ben Israel. Others studied in silence. Many faced ridicule, but they kept searching, kept remembering, because prophecy is not always thunder and trumpet blasts. Sometimes it's a whisper in the margins, a name written back into the record, a child born with a name that hadn't been spoken in generations. And here's where the mystery circles back to you, because if the regathering is already happening, if the descendants of the scattered tribes are awakening, then we must ask, what does this mean for the world? What does it mean for the church, for prophecy, for judgment? The book of Revelation speaks of a sealed number from the tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each, marked and protected. Revelation 7. Ezekiel saw dry bones rising and becoming an army. Ezekiel 37. Christ himself said he came not but for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Matthew 15:24. Could it be that the last chapter is not conversion, but remembrance? That the awakening of black Israelites is not a fringe movement, but the fulfillment of covenant? Pause and consider. These movements were not started by seminaries. They were not funded by empires. They rose from the broken places. Prisons, ghettos, refugee camps, villages. Figures like Frank Cherry, who founded a Hebrew Israelite group in 1886, drew from visions amid poverty. And yet the same scriptures echoed through their mouths. The same fire stirred in their bones. This is not about supremacy. It is about identity. A people called to covenant, punished for disobedience, scattered in judgment, and now stirred awake by prophecy. You were raised on 66 books, but what if your ancestors lived 81? The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's broader canon includes books like 1 Enoch and Jubilees, offering deeper prophetic insights. What if the canon you were given excluded not only texts, but truths? And what if the gathering we are witnessing is only the beginning, a sign that time is drawing near, that the clock of prophecy is ticking louder, and that the scattered tribes are not forgotten after all? We have journeyed through every layer of suppression, from erased imagery to mistranslated verses, from stolen maps to buried DNA. And yet none of it was enough to silence the voice of prophecy, because what God scatters, man cannot hide forever, and what God has written will be fulfilled. The God who thundered at Sinai, who wept in Gethsemane, who walked among us in sandals and sweat and skin like burnished brass, he does not forget his promises. He does not forget his people. Not the ones on thrones, not the ones in chains, not the ones who forgot their name. And so now we stand at the edge of something old and something new. The world is watching, but only a few will understand what they are seeing. The question is, are we among them, or will we miss it distracted by the version of history we were given? The tribes are stirring, the scrolls are opening, the silence is lifting. And the name of Israel, long buried, is rising from the dust. They told us the truth was simple, that Israel's story was sealed in Scripture, passed down untouched. But the truth was scattered across lands, erased from images, silenced in translations, yet not forgotten, never forgotten. Because now we remember, we began with their skin, black and beautiful, as Scripture says. Then the curse, a prophecy of ships, chains, and scattering that mirrors the transatlantic slave trade word for word. We followed the roots, Abraham near Africa's trade routes, Joseph and Moses mistaken for Egyptians, Hebrew traditions alive in African tribes who never met a missionary. Then came the erasure, whitewashed icons, colonial theology, the curse of Ham used to justify slavery. But Africa remembered, maps, songs, inscriptions, all left behind like breadcrumbs. And science confirmed it. DNA, priestly lineages, Hebrew ruins, even Scripture mistranslated, still bears witness to a Messiah with woolly hair and bronze skin. And now the final truth, the regathering has begun. From Ethiopia to the Americas, the lost tribes are awakening. This isn't theory. It's prophecy in motion. So the question is no longer, what if this is true? The question is, what will you do with it? Because once you see, you can't unsee. The God who scattered is gathering. Israel was never lost, only hidden. And now, one name at a time, they're coming home. If this journey stirred something in you, do not let it vanish in the noise. There are more whispers hidden in Scripture's pages waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us, listen closer, and keep walking this narrow road between thunder and silence.